So welcome everyone to this CRADLE seminar. This is the third in our series this year. My name is Rola Jawi. I'm an associate professor at CRADLE. It's such a pleasure to be chairing this seminar today. We have 4 rock stars on today, in fact, who will be talking about feedback literacy. Before I talk about them and how things will work, I would like to formally acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are. Well, I'm based at the moment, which are the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future, and to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So please do feel free to pop in what lands you're on and where you're based in the chat. As with previous seminars, what we'll be doing is using the chat for all sorts of chit-chatting throughout the series, throughout the conversations and the presentations. So please feel free to engage with others. If you have questions to pose for our speakers, please use the formal Q&A function. I'll try and monitor both, but if it's in the Q&A, it will definitely get asked as long as we're in time. The structure for today, the 4 speakers have about 40 minutes, which they will kind of take account of between them, and then we'll open it up for some formal question and answer for the last 20 minutes or so, and that'll bring us to the hour where we'll formally close. This seminar is being recorded, and also hopefully we've got closed captions happening. If not, can someone let me know, and we'll get that going as well. So without further ado, this seminar is looking at developing feedback literacy case studies from multiple disciplines. And this was a program of work, if you like, that was initiated through CRADLE, which invited development fellows to come and work with Phil Dawson and Joanna around all things feedback literacy. What I'll do is, I think Phil is going to kick us off. I'm going to leave everyone to present themselves and introduce themselves, just to allow them to say what they'd like. And also I think Phil is going to do an intro to the session. So without further ado, over to you, Phil.
Thank you so much, Rola. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to everyone from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to share some slides now. And yeah, as Rola said, talking about the CRADLE Development Partners scheme and feedback literacy. So some work that we've been doing. Today, we've got 4 of us here, myself and Joe, who are from CRADLE. We've got Kelli, Nicola-Richmond from the School of Health and Social Development, and Contessotto from the Faculty of Business and Law. I'm going to give you the briefest of outlines now, because I'm going to try and keep my little bit to 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about feedback literacy. So the sort of broad overview. You would have heard CRADLE people talk about feedback literacy over the past few years. So I'll give the quick tour of that. Then we're going to have some case studies of particular feedback literacy interventions that have happened at Deakin in particular disciplines as part of the CRADLE Development Partners scheme. So it'll be Kelli and Christine, not with us today, who were also part of the CRADLE Development Partners program, Janine McBurney from Science and Petra Brown from Arts and Education. So this was a scheme that happened across all 4 of our Deakin faculties. And then at the end, Joe is going to talk more broadly about the CRADLE Development Partners scheme, so the scheme that we did all this work within, and some lessons that we've learned about all that. Okay. When we start talking about feedback, we like to sort of flag that there's been a bit of a shift in what we think of as effective feedback. We go from sort of the old days of the responsibility for feedback sitting with the teacher, and the responsibility being to sort of deliver a message that was hopefully of high quality. And that was kind of it. Got a lovely cartoon there from the Feedback for Learning project. That cartoon is by Simon Kneebone, sort of showcasing the feedback canon idea. we load the cannon, we send the message, our job is done. That's the old sort of ways of thinking. We now have this view that, sorry, I'm having such slide issues. I wanted to throw in a little bit of hype here to just say that this is not just some weird insular CRADLE thing, thinking about what does feedback mean. Yeah, we've done some work around the definition of feedback, and there is a definition over there from a paper led by Michael Henderson from Monash, which we push that feedback is a process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. Now, I don't have time for the definition war. If you want to read the definition war history, I think it's in a little blog post that we chucked up on the CRADLE blog called How to Start an Argument About Feedback. But broadly speaking, I'm hoping you can come with us on this journey where the idea is that with feedback, it's not just enough to give someone useful information. We don't actually have a useful feedback process, an effective feedback process, until there's some sort of change or use of the information on the part of the learner. And that little chart on the right is Google search trends around the phrase, what is feedback? And you'll see over time, it's going up and up and up. People are concerned about what is feedback. That definition on the left is one definition. There are others out there. But I just hope you come with us on this idea that what students do with feedback really, really matters. In this sort of new view, effective feedback requires effects. Very tautological reasoning there, I know. But it's this idea that for feedback to actually be regarded as effective, having achieved its goal, we've got to have effects. That's different from what we might have thought of as good feedback. In the old days, we might have thought, oh, I gave good feedback. Well, in this view, it's not about did you give good feedback. In this view, it's about has the feedback achieved its effective purpose? So incredibly quick participatory moment here. In less than 1 minute, what should students do when they receive feedback information on the chat? Super quick. This is like half typing test. Read it, understand it, manage affect, reflect, react. This is huge. There is so much in here of what we bundle onto students as our expectations of what they should do when they receive feedback information. Now, I said it was going to be really quick, so we're on to the next one. What do you do when you receive feedback information? Super quick. And this is you, the real you, not the ideal you. All right. I'm seeing some crossover there. I saw freak out. Freak out. Yes, I freak out sometimes. Cry. Yes. So there's some challenging bits. There's deciding which bits to act on. So there's some active sort of processing of it, digesting it. Okay, lots and lots of things. And then finally, how did you learn to act in this way? What shaped the ways that you deal with feedback? Prior experience, teaching others, advice from a PhD supervisor or a mentor, experiences. I saw primary school in there. That's really interesting. So there is a long history of this for us of where we learned all of this. Learning about feedback literacy. I agree, but also as someone who has learned a bit about feedback literacy, I wish I consistently did some of these things that feedback literate people do. All right, tons more things in the chat. Really encourage you to have a look at that. But all of this is what sort of shaped discussions around feedback literacy. I'm starting off with Carless and Bowd there, though I acknowledge that there's a slightly longer history going back to Sutton in 2012. Carless and Bowd defined feedback literacy as the understandings, capacities, and dispositions needed to make sense of information and use it to enhance work or learning strategies. They have a model in there that's a pretty concise model. It's one of the go-tos, and it's what existed when we got started on this particular journey back in 2019. So we were looking at the literature. We're also talking with the Davids and understanding this model of theirs. Here in the Carless and Bowd model, we've got appreciating feedback, which I like. It's kind of double meaning bit in there. There's a sort of appreciation as in connoisseurship, in addition to a sort of appreciation as in thanks and I appreciate this process. There's a making judgments. So what parts of this information is useful? How does the quality of my work reflect in these comments? There's managing affect, because obviously feedback is a very emotional process. I think, we've probably moved on from managing affect now. I like in some of the later models how there's, making productive use of emotions in the Malloy-Bowd-Henderson model that I'll talk about later, because the idea of managing sounds a little, let's contain the emotions. And there's taking action, because as we discussed before, it's not effective feedback unless there are effects. So a feedback literate person is someone who can help make those effects happen for themselves. The Malloy-Bowd-Henderson model came next as we went on our journey through feedback literacy. It's an empirically derived model that came out of an Office for Learning and Teaching funded project with a lot of data from students about what they actually did with feedback. We've got committing to feedback as improvement, appreciating feedback as an active process, eliciting information to improve learning, processing feedback information, acknowledging and working with emotions, acknowledging feedback as a reciprocal process, and enacting the outcomes of processing of feedback information. So this model takes where we were when we started talking about feedback literacy, and it progresses us. I think we were informed a bit by this in our work, but it was still under development. So we had some conversations with people. And then something else that doesn't exactly position itself as the within the feedback literacy movement entirely, though there are mentions of feedback literacy in this, because I think this was coming through as all of those conversations were happening, is the DEFT, the Winston and Nash Developing Engagement with Feedback Toolkit. So it actually provides some really concrete, useful resources that you can use as an educator or even as a student to improve engagement with feedback. Now, I've just been through a really rapid tour of where feedback literacy was when we got started. So we saw all of that. We went through those changes with feedback. And there was something missing for us, which was discipline-based interventions focused on improving student feedback literacy in everyday courses. So we wanted to see, well, this is great. And the DEFT certainly was a big step in terms of something practical and useful that had been tried out. There is work on that. We wanted to see, how does this pan out in everyday courses at our university? So we started the CRADLE Development Partners scheme. We had 4 faculty partners. 2 are on this call today and are going to be the next presenters. And they collaborated with us in CRADLE, and there was some mentoring going on there as well around how do we do this feedback literacy thing in everyday courses. And we learned so much from them about, well, there's these ideas in the literature, but how do they actually pan out in the real world of teaching and learning? I'm not suggesting we're so separated from that real world of teaching and learning that we don't understand it, but these are people who are living and breathing it and really getting to understand that literature and working with it in their teaching practice. And our goal was to try out feedback literacy in everyday Deakin courses. It was a bit of an unusual scheme for CRADLE because we typically do research-focused schemes. And in this one, well, obviously it's CRADLE, we're still interested in research, but we put research into that sort of second place on this one because we were most interested in how does this play out in just everyday teaching and learning. And to continue on with, well, how it did play out, I'm going to hand over to Kelli Nicola-Richmond.
Thank you, Phil. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay? All good, terrific. Thank you, Phil. Hi, everyone. So Phil, as Phil mentioned, my name's Kelli Nicola-Richmond, and I undertook this project in partnership with Jo Tai and with Phil. And it was a really terrific opportunity for someone who spends the vast majority of their time in teaching leadership roles and actually teaching and in providing service to the university to undertake a project with such talented researchers like the CRADLE team are. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of what we did, and then I think we'll have questions right at the end if you have any. So there were a couple of assumptions that underpinned the work that we did that had been assumptions that were part of where the teaching team sort of sat in occupational therapy prior to this piece of work. And there was an assumption there that by the final year of a bachelor degree, or even when students arrive at university, that they know how to use feedback and they have the skills to use feedback. Prior to starting the project, I had a bit of a look at the course as a whole and realised that there were very few formal instances of teaching students how to use feedback within the program. But there was also this understanding and belief that we had that students being able to effectively use feedback was really important, not just at uni, but also when we let them go out into the workplace. In the field of occupational therapy, there isn't a grad year as such that some disciplines in health have. So students can be quite independent and need to be able to really show independent skills around feedback literacy and a whole range of other things upon graduation. So this project was undertaken with a group of final year students who were in the final trimester of their 4-year course, and they were undertaking a capstone unit that we have that is a work integrated learning placement where they focus on project management skills. So what the students had to do was undertake a partnership, a project in partnership with an occupational therapist working out in the field, so an actual clinician. And the clinicians came up with the projects and then the students would work with the clinician to deliver them. So the aims of our study or our project that we undertook were to investigate what the level of feedback literacy was of these students, and also to see whether an intervention around feedback literacy would actually change or improve their level of feedback literacy. We used a mixed methods approach. So although this was first and foremost about an intervention and changing teaching, we wanted to also evaluate what we were doing, and therefore we had research methodology and had ethics approval, etc., alongside of this. So what we did was we administered a survey at the start of the unit and at week 8 of the unit. So these students undertake these projects in a sort of a 9-week period. So a pre and post survey at the start and the finish of the unit. What we had was 20 Likert scale questions scored from never to always, and 3 open response questions. And you can see some examples of those questions on the screen there. Those questions were based on a piece of work that Phil and Joe have been doing around a tool to measure feedback literacy. And at the time that was under validation. And we modified those questions a little bit to suit the discipline and the type of task that the students were doing. And we had 52 students participate in every student in the class, and there were 74 participated in these activities, but 52 of them consented for us to use their data. So you're seeing the results for those 52 today. So as well as the pre and post survey, we also had the students participate in 2 30-minute feedback literacy interventions. And during those interventions, we talked about things about why feedback was important, definitions of feedback and feedback literacy, tips on how to effectively use feedback. And that was all based on the DEFT, which Phil's already talked about, developed by Winston and Nash. And I found as a academic, I found that a really nice and easy to apply tool that I could adapt to my teaching so that it was meaningful for the students. So we had 2 30-minute sessions in seminars, and the students also discussed a range of questions in small groups during that time. So they discussed things like, what are your experiences of using feedback? How do you make the best use of the feedback you receive? Those sorts of questions. We acknowledge that that's a fairly brief intervention, and that was potentially a limitation of what we did, but we felt that it was a feasible amount of content to add to a unit that already existed. And if we'd done bigger things, then we may have got stronger results, but we also would have had to remove other content from the unit. So quite a pragmatic decision around the length of the interventions. As well as the discussion in class, the other thing that we did with students was we added a rubric item to 2 assessments within the unit, where we asked them to take a piece of feedback that they'd received previously and to consider that feedback and reflect on it, and then also to talk about how they'd used that and built on that in their current assignment. And they got a small number of marks associated with undertaking that activity. So following all that, we had quite a bit of data to analyse, and we used descriptive statistics for the survey responses on the Likert scale, and we also used a thematic analysis approach. And what we found was that there were some statistically significant improvements when we looked at the quantitative data that the surveys produced. And you can see on the screen that there were 4 items that there were statistically significant improvements in. When we looked at the qualitative information, there were 4 things primary things that emerged. The first was that there was a really mixed engagement by the students with the activity. So although we had time allotted in class, and although we had marks associated, some students engaged really deeply with feedback when we looked at the analysis, and others engaged quite tokenistically. Lots of students, when they selected their piece of feedback to reflect on, chose things like spelling or grammar or formatting, the really sort of low cognitive load stuff. And in some cases, they'd even provide a couple of examples of that, but no reflection and no application. Based on the work we did, we can't tell whether that's because their feedback literacy was limited, or whether because they only engaged at a fairly superficial level with the task. The other interesting thing about that is that markers were clearly giving that feedback of fairly low cognitive load. Now, that we're not suggesting necessarily that that's wrong, or you should never say poor spelling or grammar or whatever, but I think what we do believe and what we do know is that that's of limited use to students, and therefore we want markers to and assessors to be trying to give feedback that's more useful for students. Other students, however, engaged really deeply, and the quote on the screen is a good example of that. So here the students identifying that the feedback information that they found useful at the immediate time, but they were also thinking about applying that and transferring it to their future as a professional. The second theme was about enacting feedback. So many of the students talked about the importance of closing the feedback loop and using the feedback that they were giving, that they were given. These students were really close to graduation, and a lot of them discussed what was going to happen next for them. And this theme was actually stronger in the post-survey data, the qualitative post-survey data, than the pre-survey data, which may suggest that our feedback intervention or administering the tool had an effect on the students' feedback literacy. Students really valued the outsider perspective, so they reported that having someone external to the piece of work was really valuable. And you can see here the students really clearly sort of saying it was extremely helpful, because you forget where your audience are coming from when you develop a piece of work. That ability to review one's own work from an outsider's perspective we see as quite a sophisticated skill, and it's a skill that I still at times struggle with after lots of years as an academic. And it was interesting to see that the students really needed that and valued that. The other thing that was interesting in relation to this one was that the students clearly valued the feedback of a clinician more so than they valued the feedback of one of their teachers from Deakin. So there was this sort of idea of them being in the real world and someone who had an authentic view of practice, and therefore their feedback being of more value. Although we didn't ask directly about anything to do with emotions, the emotional impact of feedback was really strong and clear in our data. And even looking at the chat at the start of today, you could see that idea of emotion popping up in people's answers. These fourth-year students said, I'm coming close to graduation, I'm more afraid of feedback, I feel very judged. They use language like feeling silly and angry and discouraged. And I guess the prevalence of that emotion in our data, despite the fact that we really didn't ask about it, is of note, and was for me, it was a bit of a reminder that when I'm sitting there madly marking assignments, or a sessional staff member is for me, that can have real emotional feedback on a student, and it's important that we don't forget that. So just to finish up with some key messages, I guess the first one is if we expect students to be feedback literate, we need to support the development of feedback literacy. And whilst that seems obvious, I suspect that our course isn't the only one where we just expect students to know what to do with the feedback that we give them. Perhaps, and whilst we did get some statistically significant differences, while we did collect some good data, though they weren't massive changes or improvements. And what we suggest is that feedback literacy education probably needs to start a lot earlier in a course than fourth year, and also potentially be embedded and scaffolded across a course so that we know that students do have the skills in order to be able to seek out and read and interpret the feedback that we give them. As I touched on before, the quality of feedback provided is important. Whilst we focus more so now on students' ability to read and interpret what they're given, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to remember that quality feedback needs to be given first as well. And in order to ensure that it's of good quality, we need to consider things like the casualisation of marking. And I'm talking from an Australian perspective here. It might be different in different parts of the world, but in a lot of cases now in Australia, marking's completed by sessional staff who are paid by the hour or paid by the paper, who might have less opportunity for their own professional development. Receiving constructive feedback can be emotionally challenging. We've talked about that one, and therefore we need to consider this in all aspects of providing feedback and teaching feedback literacy. And once again, as you all know, this study really highlighted to us the importance of feedback literacy beyond the university setting and into the workplace. And at the moment, when we looked at the literature, there wasn't a lot of literature that looked at that intersect between the two, and more work needs to be done in order to understand whether students can take those feedback literacy skills and actually apply them in the world of work, where potentially there's a lot less prompting and structuring and I guess, encouragement to use feedback. So just to finish off, there's a reference there to a publication that was recently published on this piece of work, if anyone's interested in reading more. And other than that, I will finish up and hand over to Christine. Thanks, everyone.
And I will unmute, nearly a rookie error there after all these months on Zoom. And welcome, everyone. I will just also share my slides, which are coming. And so I undertook many of the same interventions as Kelli did to start with. So it really was a very coordinated effort between the researchers. And so we all undertook some things the same, and then our interventions tended to be a little different. And in fact, I'm going to respond to one of the questions that's in the Q&A around the survey in a few moments. And so at the time that I undertook this research, I was Director of Teaching in the Department of Accounting. So I'm focused on in the Faculty of Business or Law in accounting. I was not actually the unit chair on any of the 3 units where I did try and intervene, because I felt that stood me quite away from what was actually happening in the unit. We also made some of the tasks, some of the interventions compulsory, and they were marked. And it felt cleaner that I was not actually marking, regardless of what students did. They were marked on their assessment tasks. They weren't marked on what I was hoping perhaps to see in this research. So what we found within the Faculty of Business and Law is, along with all universities, we do evaluations. Our students evaluated generally that they are not satisfied with the feedback they get from academics. Yet we have put considerable effort over the years to trying to improve the quality of the feedback we give students, to feed forward, to actually try and tell them how they could enhance their work next time around. And particularly in accounting, there are some clear rights and wrongs. And so I've been involved in units where we've said, right, here's part A of this task, and you submit this, and we give extremely detailed feedback on an accounting transaction. And you'll see that's wrong, and you say, this is what it should be. And they do part B that builds on this, yet they continue to make the exact same mistakes, even though we've given them the right answer. And when we've pointed that out to students, they go, oh yeah, but I don't read the feedback. I was happy with the credit. So, we've understood, A, that our feedback is not being used in the way we would hope by students, that they're not seeing it as a way of improving their learning, and that yet they're unsatisfied with what we are giving them. So the aim of my part of the project was to investigate whether feedback literacy education can improve feedback literacy, and whether different interventions affected feedback literacy to a lesser or greater extent. And, as a spoiler alert, I did not discover the Holy Grail around feedback literacy in my project. So much, and I won't go through this in detail because Kelli has described it. I used the same feedback literacy survey. We administered it in weeks 3 and 4, the same questions fundamentally to those used by Kelli. We had 3 accounting units involved in the study. The first one was an undergraduate unit, and then we had 2 postgraduate units. So students were asked to complete the survey. We gave them time to do that, and then they were shown a video that was scripted by the team, but recorded by me so that they knew who was talking to them. And we explained the purpose of feedback, sources of feedback, why it's important, how students might like to engage with that feedback. And then we did some other interventions in 2 of the units. So following the survey and the video, in Unit B, no further interventions were introduced. So students were stopped there. In Unit A, students were asked to set actionable and measurable goals related to their planned use of feedback as part of their unit assessment. So in this particular unit, they were always asked to reflect on something that was considered to be important in their educational journey. So in this particular time, we chose feedback. So we actually gave students feedback on their actionable and measurable goals. We talked about what SMART goals were, and we actually made them stop and think and document what their 2 goals would be around the feedback they would receive throughout the unit. So once other assessment tasks were completed, students got their results with feedback, and then subsequently students were asked to reflect and provide evidence on whether or not they met their own individual goals on their use of feedback. So it's very much around working out what they wanted from the feedback. We weren't telling them what they should want, and reflecting on whether they did what they thought they might like to do. In the 3rd unit, again, this was part of an assessment task, but they were asked to reflect on their prior use of feedback and how effective that had been, and then how they could better use feedback in the future. So this was a once-off. So in the Unit A, they actually set goals then and there and reflect on them afterwards. In Unit C, they only had to reflect on their previous use of feedback and what they might like to do in the future. They didn't then reflect on whether they'd done that in the future. So results, firstly, very disappointing number of survey responses. Students really didn't get really excited about this opportunity. I did a lot of work. So I went to lectures to speak to students to encourage them. We emailed them, their lecturers did speak to students, but still quite disappointing results across the 3 units. Most of the time, students responded positively to the survey questions, reporting that they did seek out and use their survey half or most of the time, which anecdotally is not what I see, but we only see what we want to see perhaps. If we look at the survey results, we did a second survey, same questions at the end of the trimester, and we then compared the two results quantitatively from survey 1 and survey 2 using the Wilcoxon-Sain-Ranks test, p-value of 5%, to evaluate the impact, if any, of the different interventions that we had undertaken. So when all we did, which was in Unit B, use have the survey and the video, we had a change only in one behaviour, and that was that the students claimed they looked for clues from different courses about how to do their work well. So no other significant responses. In Unit C, where students were specifically asked to reflect on their use of feedback received in prior assessment tasks, there was no significant changes in any of the responses between the surveys, which was quite disappointing. Unit B, we had insufficient results to be able to use. So in fact, the only intervention that seemed to make any difference, but only in one unit, was actually the little video that they were presented with. Disappointingly, we saw nothing in the units. When I moved to the qualitative results, that was a little bit more interesting, more about what the students said to us about the quality of our feedback. And I think there's lessons for us to learn here. So the survey asked students, who did they use for survey, and to tell us around how they use survey in open text questions. And so students stated they used their teachers, their peers, and written feedback on assignments as sources of information. And surprisingly to me, they kept a record of that feedback. So they were actually monitoring their performance. They did try to act on feedback in subsequent assessment tasks, but, and here's perhaps lessons for us academics, they found there was a lack of consistency in the assignment feedback. So what one assessor may say they wanted, another would actually say we didn't want this. And so we were giving them very mixed messages and perhaps explaining why students aren't as feedback literate as we would like. They also said quite strongly that assessors had different opinions on what mattered in assessment tasks. And this really made feedback less relevant for them in subsequent tasks, particularly in subsequent units. And I think that's very problematic for us when we're teaching a major or a discipline, that you would think we would like to be aligned and giving students clear messages of what is important to understand about your assignment and your feedback and what we want from an accounting professional once they graduate. So students in the second survey reported that feedback was not always presented in a helpful way. And often we only focused on what they did well or what they did badly on. So in other words, there was not a lot of, this is what you could do in the future. This is how you could approach this differently. So it did suggest that the students are actually looking at their feedback and they are thinking about their feedback, and they're actually making judgments about the quality of the feedback, and that perhaps we are have a part to play in improving our approaches to feedback across the discipline. I think between disciplines, there's always going to be different emphasis. And so we need to do something too to help our academics provide information that enables students to use it and become more feedback literate. And so that's all from me. So short and sweet.
Now, hopefully you can now see my screen slides. I'm taking you all a little bit away from the specifics around feedback literacy to talk a little bit more about the Development Partners scheme and what we've learned from working together. So as Phil sort of outlined at the start, our goals around having this whole scheme was to promote dialogue between educators and researchers on topics that CRADLE are interested in, so assessment and digital learning, and to really learn from the people that we work with about what's going on at Deakin and what's happening in learning and teaching, but also to enhance what was going on where we could find places where things could be improved. And for us, I guess, as mainly researchers, to understand how applying the concepts and the ideas that we've developed in research, how that actually plays out in practice. So to actually really figure out, where are the barriers, what are the challenges? And I think Kelli and Christine both outlined a number of those things about how stuff in the real world doesn't quite go the way that you think it is in your head when you're being idealistic about what could happen in education. So in 2019, we started that off with a feedback literacy project. And in 2021, we continued this with some work on inclusive assessment. And we are still doing that work into this year. One of the things we did learn was that things take longer than the time that we had originally allocated to them. So everything's a bit of a longer process. So you'll hear more about inclusive assessment, I'm sure, in the coming years. So the whole development partner scheme, and again, Phil already kind of outlined some of this. We started off with workshops and meetings to discuss the research and implementation ideas. Then we did have some funding to do that implementation and evaluate and research and get ethics approval and all of that. The expectations of what happens as a result, firstly, is sharing what worked and what didn't work with others, part of what we're doing here today. But I think also Kelly and Christine and Janine and Petra have all also been chatting about what they did with colleagues. And that's also a really valuable thing because, you know, to get perspectives and to share the work informally is also a really great thing to do. And optional, which didn't really work out so well in terms of conference attendance, given the time period in which we did this with COVID getting in the way. But research outputs was an optional extra. And I'm very pleased to say that we did manage to do that. We have a book chapter and Kelly's paper. So a wonderful first effort from everyone. So to summarise some of those lessons learnt, I think one of the main things that we found in running the scheme and actually having four very brilliant people with lots of great ideas was the collaboration between CRADLE and everyone was heaps easier than trying to figure it out by ourselves. And there was so much sharing and sort of problem solving and troubleshooting that we did together, which I think was really valuable. Another thing which you will have identified and what Christine and Kelly talked about was that achievable goals in what can actually be changed in the everyday course of what everyone needs to do in their teaching was really important to ensure that we had something to work with and that we could actually achieve what we set out to. And as I foreshadowed earlier, everything takes longer than you think. Like setting up the survey took quite a while once we worked out what items we needed. The ethics approval process, getting students to complete surveys, even writing papers in that book chapter, everything took a bit longer than what we thought it would. So in terms of actually making that successful translation from ideas into doing something, I think, and perhaps especially during these past couple of years, being generous to ourselves and how much time we budget for this was a really important part and something that I think we all managed well together in the end. So that's all I really have to say about the process. It's been lovely to work with everyone on the team for this project. And I guess it's time for questions. So Rola, if you'd like to help us through.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. A big round of clapping from me and everyone out there in virtual land. Kelly has been very studious and has answered many of the questions, but I will start a conversation going and hopefully the people out there will add to the questions. I'll start with a controversial question from Jeffrey. Is the whole idea of feedback in any form just plain wrong? Do we have any good reason to think that students learn by finding out what we think of their efforts? It seems to be based on a behaviourist idea that most of us don't follow.
I'll speak to that. I think there is really strong evidence that feedback in some way is one of the most powerful effects we have in learning. And I'd point to John Hattie's meta-analyses and other people who've done work along similar lines. The argument seems to be that feedback is very powerful. However, you speak to this idea of a behaviourist, teacher-focused view of feedback, and I agree that's a problematic way to think about feedback. The idea that it's information from teacher to student. The idea with all this feedback literacy stuff, my utopian view is that we equip students so that they are the masters of their own feedback worlds, seeking feedback information from all over the place. Some of that's from teachers, but a lot of it's from all sorts of other sources, because ultimately they're going to be without teachers when they graduate, and they need to be able to navigate all of that. So yes to feedback being powerful, but agree with you, no to the sort of behaviourist, teacher-centric view of it.
Any other comments on that? If not, I'll move us along. There's a question here from Dolly. Is asking students what they think went wrong first helpful? Any takers? Christine?
I'll answer that only based on some experience that I've had, so not proper research, let me say that. I experimented a couple of times with students at submitting their work and then having them to actually grade their work, to say what they thought their work was worth. And some students were quite perceptive and others seemed to have no idea about the quality of their work. But when I actually would speak to those students, so the deal was that they would put their graded result in, and I would not look at it till all marking was done, so that there was no cross-contamination. But when I spoke to them and said, well, this wasn't really a realistic, you've given yourself a 10 and you've got a 6, for example, most of them were, well, that was in case, right? In case you didn't do what you said, in case you thought about it, I wanted you to think I was a 10 and I thought I was a 10. So it's really hard, I think, to actually assess. The students are playing another game in that they want to convince you, and they don't necessarily trust everything that we say to them. So it was interesting, but you don't know also whether students said that as a protective mechanism once they'd been found to be not able to judge the quality of the work. So I think it's an interesting question, but I think often many students, I think you go, I got a credit, I wanted a credit, I'm happy, but I don't know if they're in a position to say, I think I did get a credit. But maybe someone's done some proper research in this space.
I'm not going to talk about proper research, Christine, but in clinical placement in health, we teach the clinical supervisors who supervise our students often to use a really simple little formula where they start by saying to the students, what do you think are 3 things you did well? And then the supervisor or the marker, if we're applying it, say, well, these are the things I think you did well. And then what are 3 things you think you could improve? And then the marker will say, these are 3 things. So, Dolly, I think it's good for the students to have to reflect on that. But I would always start with the positives first, I guess. But taking something like that, which is a one-on-one consultation or discussion, and applying it to a unit with 1,400 students is much harder. And I think that's, for me, and I am a pragmatist through and through, is the challenge is how we do some of this stuff better, and how we support students to use feedback more effectively within the realms and constraints of higher education.
Thank you, Kelly and Christine. Christine, I'm struck by your notion of the parallel worlds or games that the students are playing, and you're absolutely right. As educationalists, we think they want to do the best work possible, but sometimes they just want to work out what we want from them. In fact, most of the time, and they have their own goals, whether it's a pass or a credit or whatever that is, and you can't fault them for working within the systems that we've set up. There's a question here from Oriel, apologies if I've mucked that up. The question is around detailed rubrics and whether detailed rubrics help with consistency across markers. Are they routinely used? I'm going to interpret from that question that, in fact, they are routinely used by staff when marking, but how are students engaged with using them? That's how I'm going to interpret that question. Christine, Kelly, what work do you do to engage students with rubrics? Because we know that merely giving it to students is not enough.
Roller, in our course, every assessment task would have a rubric, and students engage with them very closely. I'm not always sure it's for the right reasons, though, and sometimes I'll get questions about them wanting, I get torn between having a bit of flexibility in a rubric and the students wanting absolute clarity around what you're expecting because it's associated with marks. But we certainly find that our students use them and use them very closely. In the review of assessment policy and procedure that I'm leading across Deakin at the moment, that differs between faculties. So we know in arts and education that rubrics aren't as strongly used, and they're probably not as prescriptive as certainly some of the ones are in the area that I come from.
And if I jump in from our area, we use rubrics for all assessment tasks, and this is a very clear objective answer. As soon as there's any judgment at all, we need a rubric for the markers as much as for the students. I think it's fair to say that some students use them very, very closely, and other students really disregard them. What I did do, which I actually found very beneficial, was over my T3 unit, rather than talk to the rubric or about the rubric, I actually did a PowerPoint and put some key things on it, and actually talk to the PowerPoint about what I was looking for and what a good answer could include, and you know, to support students. And I actually found that was much more powerful than just giving a rubric. And what it did was remove, I had 150 students. I got one assessment task question. That everyone seemed very happy that this PowerPoint, where I spoke to them through the PowerPoint, was actually quite valuable. And I would say I'd do that again as being much more valuable. Hearing it from my voice seemed to be more valuable than hearing it through a rubric. And also, I didn't say this is a fail and this is a pass. I'd say, well, a good answer would do X, Y, and Z. So, I mean, it's a trial of one time, but I did find it quite powerful.
Thank you, Christine. The next question is around modelling and using modelling of their interventions. So did any of the teaching partners model the ways in which they might seek, reflect and use information as part of the feedback process? And in fact, there is some evidence in the psychological safety literature that suggests that if teachers model their ways of actually using feedback, it does actually create a more psychologically safe environment for students to then seek feedback. But I'm not sure how that played out in your interventions, or whether Jo and Phil, you have anything to add to that.
No, Rolla, I certainly didn't, but it's a good idea.
And I didn't, and I don't think I've ever tried it either.
I think Janine, who's not here, really did focus on the emotion and the affect part of feedback, and was talking in her intervention quite a bit about how that might. So she also did some teaching sessions and had the survey, and she did actually focus a little bit on modelling around, you know, it's okay to have emotions around feedback and what to do in response to that. So it's on one aspect of that feedback information use, but not all the aspects. Phil looks like he wants to say something.
I was actually sorry, I was coughing, but I will say something. I don't teach like undergrad or postgrad coursework at the moment, but I do have HDR students, and something that I wrote with them in mind was this piece on defanging feedback that I've just chucked into the chat to try and just give an example of a tricky feedback process that I found myself in, and really agree with that. It also reminds me of the intellectual candor work that Liz Milloy and Margaret Bierman have done. That idea that we want to show the experiences of feedback that we've had to students.
Thank you all. I'll ask this question to the whole panel. Do you know of any educational technologies that might facilitate or augment some of these practices around feedback literacy that we are talking about here, or some that might be essential to the process?
Roller, it wasn't part of this piece of work and we didn't evaluate it, but in this unit, so in the unit that I've been talking about today, we continue to use this intervention a couple of years later, and we've also introduced the use of feedback fruits. So all of the students have to put an executive summary at the end of the unit about their project into feedback fruits, and then 2 other students review that and provide feedback, and there's some marks attached to that as well. So that tool works reasonably well. It's a tool that Deakin supports, so we've got good support around using it, but that's quite nice. It added to the marking load because prior to that we didn't have that piece, but it does give them a little bit of formative feedback, because they get the feedback before their final assignment is due, and they're getting marked in the feedback they give others. They're not getting marked on their own work, if you like. So it also brought in that idea of formative versus summative assessment.
I guess on sort of technology and feedback, sometimes I get into these conversations about sort of technology and feedback literacy, and people go, oh, audio feedback, that's going to improve feedback literacy. And it's, as Kelly's example illustrates, it's about something that's going to do the students producing feedback or engaging in feedback. That's feedback literacy. Some of the other conversations people want to say, oh, if you train markers on giving better feedback comments, or you do video feedback, or this, that, or the other, those are interventions to improve feedback information. So I think it's really important we go down the line of things like what Kelly's talking about. I'm only aware of one sort of toolkit that was built sort of specifically around feedback engagement, and it's the FEATS thing that I've chucked into the chat that Naomi Winston has worked on. And I think in future we'll probably see more sort of portfolio tools structured to include feedback information as a persistent piece that students can go back to. Then maybe we can scaffold on that. But yeah, just if anyone goes away from this thinking ed tech, think about the ed tech that gets students actively engaged as the controllers of their feedback process, not receiving shinier feedback.
Thank you both. Yuso and Sarah, I'm going to hold your questions for a minute and wrap up the official part of this seminar. Thank you, a big thank you to the presenters for their insights. I'm taking away two things really, that we are so constrained by this notion of feedback as giving, and then so we get stuck with this idea of, well, then all we can do is ask students to use it. But actually there's so many other things that came through in your talks today about how we engage students in comparisons or in thinking about, you know, standards in different ways, and in actually thinking about and processing feedback, whether it's through peer review. The second thing that struck me is to do with maybe you don't want to go the full hog on building students' feedback literacy without actually building staff literacy, because that can cause perhaps some issues. They're just a couple of thoughts I came away with. I want to put a plug in for our next seminar. We have Professor David Carles on the 3rd of May at 2 p.m. Melbourne time. He will be talking about new directions for feedback seeking research and practice. So I think that will be an excellent session like this one has been. If you want to stay back for a few more minutes, maybe another 5 or so to 10 minutes, I'll pose the last 2 questions and then we can let the team off the hook. So do stay around, but also feel free to leave if you've got other things to go to. So with that, the 3 more questions. Question from Yuso, and I think maybe this is for you, Phil, because you wrote the authentic feedback piece, which I'm still not sure what I think about authentic feedback, but what do you see are the connections of authentic assessment feedback and feedback literacy? Many feedback practices, such as using rubrics, are not very authentic. On the other hand, many authentic feedback practices at the workplace are not very sustainable. And he is referring to our academic work and the abundance of feedback practices, I think.
Yeah, so yeah, authentic feedback is in a paper that wrote with David Carles and Pamela Lee from Hong Kong U. And it's this idea that we might want to, in higher education, think about the feedback practices that happen in the world of work or the world of the discipline or wherever students end up, and prepare students for those feedback practices by, you know, simulating them, replicating them in some sort of way, like what we've done over the past couple of decades with authentic assessment. So it's the idea that we look at, what do you need to be able to do when you graduate? What feedback practices do you need to be able to be a part of out there in the world? Now, Yuso's comment is that many of the feedback practices that we do in higher ed don't really represent those things in the world of work. And I would certainly agree with you, Yuso. That's not to say that they're not useful things to do, or that all feedback should always be authentic either. There's a justification, things like scaffolding, for instance. There's also, as you say, some feedback practices in the workplace are not sustainable. I'd also say some feedback practices in the workplace are horrible and don't have an educational value to them at all. The challenge is when students leave us, they need to be able to engage in those feedback practices they find in their world of work. So there was a question on there where someone asked, has there been any work done on mindfulness? And I'm thinking of a counsellor at Monash Uni whose name I've forgotten, who saw that there was a very authentic feedback practice happening in architecture around the crit, where students really get together and pile criticism on a piece of student work, and it was being very destructive emotionally for the students. So this counsellor actually did a mindfulness intervention with the students to help them in that very moment of receiving all of that horrible criticism, because the idea was not to shield the students from it, because they need to be able to do it to act as a professional architect, but to develop them so they're capable of it. And that's really, the managing affect or the making productive use of emotions part of feedback literacy, which you want to develop for authentic feedback. Hope I've answered your question there well, Yuso.
Thanks, Phil. And I should say my reservation aren't about authentic feedback, but more around the transferability and how important context is to all the conversations that we're having today. Does student experience of feedback in the school system have a bearing on effective engagement with feedback? And do we think that feedback literacy is perhaps better or different in mature students or students from equity backgrounds? Are there generational differences as well?
That's a lot of questions in one, and I don't feel game to respond. But I would, other than to say that whatever students' experiences are previously, it's going to have an impact on what they get now. So that's yes. Is it different between generations? I don't know. But I suspect, when I've studied as a mature age student, I've looked at feedback differently to when I was younger, because you put it in, I now say, when I do stuff, I don't have the same amount of time as when I was at home and mum cooked my dinner. That you sometimes say, I could do better than this, but there just isn't time. So I suspect there are differences, but there'll be many students who also didn't have a mum at home cooking their dinner when they were doing their undergrad. So I suspect that would be a very difficult thing to unpack, but maybe someone, Cradle, might do that.
Well, we do have a PhD student who is interested in feedback histories, who will be doing this work over the next few years. I would say, Sarah, it vary quite a bit with individuals, and perhaps not to generalize that if you're a mature age student, you have better capabilities with feedback, but to meet the student where they are, perhaps. But they might have had more feedback experiences in their journeys, and so that could set them up differently. Jo?
I think from the work we've done on inclusive assessment, it's not so much that there's a difference in engaging in feedback or what students want to get out of feedback, but certainly students from diverse backgrounds and the widening participation students is what I'm thinking of. It's not so much that they don't want to engage with feedback or that there's a different engagement, but it's more about navigating the university processes that might lead them to be able to, say, clarify feedback, access additional help to interpret the feedback. And also at times that feeling of, am I actually allowed to go up and talk to the teacher about the marks that I've been given? So a student who comes from a more traditional background might have family or friends who go, oh yeah, well, why don't you just go chat to the tutor about that mark you got, or about what they mean when they wrote that comment on your essay. But other students might not have those additional know-how that's not specifically around the feedback itself or how they engage with feedback, but it's about the social environment. So that is something to take into account about what we do when we're inviting students to come and clarify feedback with us and that sort of thing.
That's an excellent point, Jo. And actually a point to work by Kalako in mainly schooling, but also a little bit in higher ed, that says that less students from low SES backgrounds feel less entitled to actually ask questions and seek feedback. So that's a really good point. Final question, and then we will wrap up. A question from Matt Brett about whether we have any thoughts as to how our work on feedback can be extended to or has influenced your practice in peer review of research and student peer review of assessment.
Speaking from a personal
Jo, this has got to be yours.
Well, from a personal perspective, when I'm doing reviews now, I always wonder, is my feedback actually actionable? Am I actually will there be an opportunity for the person on the other end of that information to do something about it, and something that's feasible? We all know, I guess, having received reviews where they just wanted a completely different study, but that's not really the actionable thing that you can do with the paper that you've just written. So personally, I think I've oriented myself as I do more feedback research to think about those things and to think about what impact my comments and how I craft them. So yes, the shiny feedback message, how they might impact someone, and to think about where the author might be coming from. In terms of student peer feedback, I guess I've always had that, and students' review of assessment, I've always had that we really do need to engage students in discussion about what the standards are, evaluative judgment, before we can actually get them to really make useful comments on each other's work, and to sort of reassure them that their comments are going to be useful in some ways as long as they target them appropriately. So I don't know what came first though, whether I was more on the peer assessment side of things before I came to feedback research, but someone else might have some thoughts now.
Jo, I'll jump in. As someone who worked as a clinician and a health practitioner for a long time before I came to Deakin, and thought the health paradigm of research was the only paradigm and didn't realise there were different ones at the start, then undertook a PhD in teaching and learning, and had my first article rejected 3 times and absolutely torn apart. I don't think that experience will ever leave me. And at the time, for quite some time, I thought I was the only person that happened to. Of course, over the years, I've learned that lots of us have that experience. But that often comes to my mind when I'm providing feedback. So having had that real emotional, and there were tears, experience myself, that's really influenced how I review other people's research articles or how I review my students' work. So I think it probably benefited me in that instance.
Phil, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for me, it's all summed up in the children's book, Thanks for the Feedback, I think. Which is a great book, summary of heaps of the stuff that we would talk about. And it's just that people are trying to help when they provide feedback information. And that sounds like the most basic, mundane thing, but I don't think I truly understood it to the depth that I do now until I started working in feedback. And just that switch in orientation has helped me so much when receiving feedback information. I just needed it to be drilled into my head.
Amazing. That's such a good place to end. Thank you so much to the whole team for this seminar. It has been really engaging. Lots of thanks coming through on the chat now. Michelle, in answer to your question, if you registered for this seminar where you would have got the link, the recording will be sent in the same way to that email address. So you should receive it that way. So thank you, everyone. And remember not to be reviewer too. See you at the next one. Bye.